Welcome to this episode of What's Going On. I'm your host, Kurt France. Today we're very fortunate to have with us lead investigator of the federal investigation into the death of once convicted child molester, Jeffrey Epstein. Because of security reasons, we can't give his name or even the agency with which he is associated, so we'll refer to him as Mr. C. Mr. C, thank you for being here. Mr. C came by my house rather unexpectedly because he wanted to present what the government has found related to Mr. Epstein's death. And we really do appreciate your time and are looking forward to learning what you have learned.
I'm pleased to set the record straight for the public.
Thank you, Mr. C. Mr. Epstein died 2 weeks ago, found dead 2 weeks ago, apparently from suicide. What can you tell us about what your investigation has found?
The government's investigation has been completed. There is nothing suspicious about Mr. Epstein's death. It was a suicide.
I'm stunned. In the federal government moving that fast, in just a couple of weeks you've completed your investigation?
Actually, in less than 2 weeks, yes.
But haven't federal investigators just started searching Epstein's so-called pedophile island?
We won't find anything there at Little St. James Island.
Why did it take a month for the investigation of that island to occur? Private drones have been flying by the island and been posting on YouTube videos of heavy machinery, including bulldozers, on that island, potentially destroying evidence.
There was no evidence to destroy.
How do you know that?
We have insider sources, but for national security reasons I cannot divulge their names.
What national security reasons can exist? The man ran a child sex trafficking ring, and he's now dead. You're not going to say any more about the pedophile island? 3 weeks prior to his death, Jeffrey Epstein was found in his cell in a fetal position with damage done to his neck, was believed to have been caused by a suicide attempt. He was placed on suicide watch. But apparently he wasn't on suicide watch. Or was he on suicide watch when he died?
He was deemed by himself and his lawyers as no longer a suicide threat. A psychologist evaluated him and agreed with that assessment, and he was taken off suicide watch. He got what he needed.
Well, isn't the policy to be taken off suicide watch to get approval from a medical doctor and a warden?
He got what he needed.
He got both approvals.
He got what he needed.
Why was Epstein's cellmate removed from his cell just hours before he was found dead?
He didn't want to have a cellmate. He was doing fine.
He was doing fine when he killed himself, just a few hours later?
Sometimes when people have something they want to hide, don't want others to see, they can put on a front and conceal things. He was able to hide what he didn't want others to see.
And the psychologist, the warden, the staff, his lawyers, they were all fooled by his fake presentation?
Fakeries can fool a lot of people a lot of the time.
Why wasn't Jeffrey Epstein under constant surveillance? He was the highest valued prisoner since perhaps Lee Harvey Oswald. There was compelling evidence and numerous witnesses that for more than a decade it showed that Epstein was operating a pedophile ring that was used by many political leaders, leaders of industry, and royalty. His court case could have had tremendous worldwide impact. His victims could have gained a measure of justice. How was he allowed to commit
He
suicide?
was supposed to be watched and video recorded, but the guards fell asleep and the cameras didn't operate correctly.
2 guards, both fell asleep at the same time.
People need sleep. Being a jail guard is a tough job and it's tiring.
They slept knowing that Epstein's cellmates had just been removed, and this would be the first time in weeks that he would be left alone.
Apparently they were tired.
Based on interviews with the with the jail staff, there were at least 8 staff members interviewed that said there was a policy that Epstein was not to be left alone and unwatched in his cell, yet he was alone and unwatched in his cell when he died. How do you explain that?
It doesn't matter how many staffers knew that information. At any point in time, there's only a small number of people responsible for watching Epstein. In this case, there were only 2 at that time, and they both fell asleep.
And Epstein went hours without being checked, even though the policy was he would be looked in on every 30 minutes.
Evidently.
And how many cameras were in Epstein's cell or in the immediate area recording anyone entering or exiting Epstein's cell?
There were several cameras, 9 I think.
And none of those cameras worked.
Things break and malfunction. Or in the case of cameras, they can be pointed in a direction that they don't collect any information of value.
And that's what happened to those cameras?
Some combination of those things, yes.
Is that a common occurrence in a federal jail, that many cameras not working or not oriented properly?
Not very common, but it happened in this case.
So you think it was just a coincidence?
It was just a series of coincidences.
And there wasn't anything recorded by any of the cameras that were helpful in your investigation?
Nothing that was useful in our final report.
Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York City, the nation's mayor, was very familiar with the Metropolitan Correctional Center, the federal jail in which Epstein died. And he called the death, and I quote, mind-boggling and impossible to happen. He said that to take Epstein off suicide watch was crazy, that he was the highest priority inmate. And the mayor also said that it's very hard for me to understand an explanation of why this guy wasn't watched 24 hours a day.
There's absolutely no excuse for this. What happened here, to me, is mind-boggling. It's impossible to happen. I do not understand how anyone can explain not having him under 24-hour surveillance or not checking the camera constantly. That condition remained on the day that they took off the suicide watch. Are they crazy?
With regard
you got to be nuts. It would be very hard for me to understand the explanation as to why this man wasn't watched 24 hours a day.
People make mistakes. Everyone does. The guards at MCC have a lot of responsibility. It takes a lot of effort to keep eye on someone in suicide watch, so if they don't need to be in suicide watch, they should be taking off of it. The mayor should be more careful in what he says.
Cameron Lindsay, a former warden of 3 federal facilities, told NBC News, and I quote, "For them to pull Epstein off suicide watch is shocking. For someone this high profile, with these allegations and this many victims, who has had a suicide attempt in the last few weeks, you can take absolutely no chances. You leave him on suicide watch until he's out of there." Was Lindsay wrong?
Mr. Lindsay wasn't there. He doesn't know everything. He needs to be more careful in what he says. NBC News needs to be more careful in what it reports.
What do you mean he needs to be more careful?
Just that. Those types of statements and reports can lead to conspiracy theories. and that can weaken the national order and the world order.
Do you think the government giving the general public incomplete or inaccurate or inconsistent, incomprehensible information to the public gives rise to conspiracy theories?
That's why I'm here, telling the full story and setting the public straight.
There are conflicting reports about how Jeffrey Epstein was found in his cell. That he was found hanging, that he was found lying on the floor, that he was found unconscious and unresponsive, and he was found dead. How was he found?
Silenced.
Silence? What the hell does that mean? I mean, was he hanging, lying on the floor, alive, dead? Can you expand on that?
No.
When the autopsy was being performed, Barbara Sampson, the New York City medical examiner, delayed the completion of the autopsy, citing the need for, quote, more information. What more was she looking for?
An autopsy tells a story. It tells what happened before the death, during the death, and after the death. The pathologist needed more information to tell the story. That's why she had to wait.
And she determined the cause of death to be by suicide by hanging.
That is correct. It was a suicide.
The autopsy found some small broken bones in Epstein's death that are consistent with strangulation but not consistent with hanging. Did that finding give your investigation reason to further explore the cause of death?
Even an assisted suicide is still a suicide.
Assisted suicide?
I didn't say Epstein's suicide was assisted. I just said even an assisted suicide is a suicide.
Now, there hadn't been a suicide in his jail in over 20 years.
All streaks must come to an end.
Epstein's lawyers enlisted the services of well-known pathologist Dr. Michael Baden to review the autopsy for accuracy. In 1977, Dr. Baden reviewed the autopsy of John F. Kennedy for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and he endorsed the findings of the Warren Commission.
Yes, he did.
Dr. Baden also testified on behalf of O.J. Simpson and Phil Spector.
Yes, he did.
In each of those cases, Dr. Baden took a position that was counter to the beliefs of most Americans. For the general public to have confidence in your final investigation report, do you think choosing Dr. Baden was, as the objective overseer, was bad optics?
What are you going to do? Epstein's lawyers chose him.
Around the time of Epstein's death, inmates in the area said that they heard shrieks coming from Jeffrey Epstein's cell. Did you interview those inmates, and what did you determine those sounds were and who made them?
We interviewed everyone. Sometimes when someone's being killed, or when someone is killing themselves, they make noises. They scream. It's not uncommon. And sometimes people hear things that aren't there. They're mistaken.
A person can yell while they're hanging themselves?
It is a strange sounding yell, more of a shriek.
Did any of the cameras in the area, including those that were working but just oriented incorrectly, pick up any sounds that might be suspicious, the shrieks or other noises?
There was nothing recorded by the cameras that made our final report.
Why was the warden of the MCC, Lamine Nadaya, not fired but simply moved to another position in a different jail?
As you suggested, optics matter.
And the two guards that fell asleep on duty, they were put on leave
Yes,
with pay, meaning this is paid vacation time.
they were doing their jobs. It was earned.
M.O. Nesto of the New Yorker twice interviewed Jeffrey Epstein's former bodyguard, an MMA fighter, Russian Igor Zinoviev. The first interview was done 4 years ago when Igor talked about Epstein's young girls, and Igor gave him, Epstein, advice on not to have teenage girlfriends. It was advice that Epstein didn't accept. In the more recent interview, occurred a few days after Epstein's death, Igor backpedaled on what he had said earlier, that he didn't, and now he says he didn't see teenage girls with Epstein, and he became rather tight-lipped. When asked about his former boss's suicide, Igor said, quote, "Somebody helped him to do that."
Russians are generally not to be trusted.
Igor was asked about Epstein being notified that police were coming before he was arrested. Former bodyguard responded with, and I quote, "Listen, don't put yourself in trouble. Seriously. Just be careful. I'm not kidding." End quote. Don't you think this sounds suspicious? As if some powerful people are pressuring or threatening others to be silent?
No, I just think it sounds like good advice.
Did you interview Epstein's bodyguard?
Igor didn't want to talk.
There are reports that people who work at the Metropolitan Correctional Center are not being helpful to the Department of Justice's investigation into Epstein's death. Is that true? And were they helpful in your investigation?
We found very helpful and smart and careful.
Let's go back to Epstein's earlier conviction of procuring for prostitution a girl under the age of 18. In 2005, he was investigated by the state of Florida for molesting a 14-year-old girl. After 2 years of investigations and court proceedings, during which the FBI reported that there were 40 confirmed minors that Epstein had sexually molested, and that the Miami Herald identified twice that number, Epstein struck a plea deal, and he pled guilty to just 2 charges and was sentenced to just 18 months in prison. He only served 13 months, and during most of that time, he was allowed out of the jail, of the prison, on, quote, work release for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. His cell door was not locked. Did you investigate why his plea deal and sentence were so lenient, and why it was in violation of victims' rights law?
We only investigated his suicide.
At the time of his plea deal and sentencing in June of 2008, the Palm Beach police chief accused the state of giving Epstein preferential treatment. And the Miami Herald said the U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta gave Epstein, quote, the deal of a lifetime. When asked about that deal, Acosta said he was told that Epstein, quote, belonged to intelligence, was, quote, above his pay grade, and to, quote, leave it alone. Epstein himself, in early 1980s, told people he was an intelligence agent. Did you investigate whether Epstein was an agent of an intelligence agency?
We only investigated his suicide.
Were you suspicious about the fact that Epstein committed suicide just hours after the release of thousands of pages of documents that had been sealed during the earlier child prostitution trial that named some rich and powerful people?
We only investigated his suicide. Those documents were nothing but hearsay and false accusations.
Your smile whenever you refer to Epstein's suicide, that reminds me of the smile George H. Bush gave when he talked about Lee Harvey Oswald as JFK's killer.
Coincidence.
After a deluded gunman assassinated President Kennedy, after a deluded gunman assassinated President Kennedy.
Did you look at Epstein's earlier injuries and determine that they were the result of attempted suicide?
Yeah, we did that, and they were.
Epstein himself said those injuries were the result of someone assaulting him. Was he wrong?
That was an attempted suicide.
It was reported that a, quote, unidentified associate claimed Jeffrey Epstein's body. Did you find out who this unidentified associate was?
I believe it was his brother Mark that claimed the body.
Why would his brother be reported as an unidentified associate?
Those weren't my words.
Epstein's former cellmate, a rather large ex-cop, accused murderer, Nicholas Tartaglione, has said he has information about Epstein's death, but that if he shares it, quote, there will be a price to pay. He's said guards have told him to shut up, stop talking, and stop complaining. Again, this sounds like people on the inside, people who are ostensibly trying to determine what will actually happen, are involved in suppressing the truth. Are they?
I'm not trying to suppress the truth. Everything I've told you is the truth. Trust me.
There was a bruise on the side of Epstein's face when he was found in his cell. What was the cause of that bruise?
Probably from his suicide.
If you are hanging, how do you bruise your cheek?
Maybe when he was released from the noose, he fell and landed on his cheek.
You didn't think that the bruise warranted further investigation?
No, I have a bruise on my left arm right now. I have scratches on my backs of my hands. No one tried to kill me. Bruises and injuries like that happen for lots of reasons.
Epstein had a falsified Austrian passport with his photo but with a different name. Did that suggest that perhaps he was working with an intelligence agency or perhaps a larger organized crime organization?
He had a lot of money and he could travel incognito if he wanted to.
There are questions about how Epstein acquired his huge wealth. Was understanding how he gathered that wealth part of your investigation?
We only investigated his suicide.
Given that his residence and island were wired to video record what was happening there, and that the investigation of his New York home uncovered thousands of videos labeled with the girl's name and the name of rich and powerful people. Do you believe he was involved in blackmail?
Well, we probably won't ever know now that he committed suicide.
In 2008, Jeffrey Epstein told a New York Times reporter that he had dirt on powerful people, including information about their sexual proclivities and recreational drug use. Now, it seems like there was powerful motivation from powerful people to want Epstein dead. Did your investigation into Epstein's death look at any powerful people identified by the women who were sexually abused by, or who claimed they were sexually abused as young girls when they were part of Epstein's pedophile ring by these people, as possible suspects contributing to his death?
There is no reason to look for suspects in a suicide.
Attorney General William Barr said that he was, quote, appalled by Epstein's death while he was in federal custody, and that it, quote, raises serious questions that must be answered. What's your opinion?
I have answered them as part of this investigation.
According to Rasmussen polls a few days after Epstein's death, a plurality of Americans believe that Epstein was, quote, murdered to prevent him from testifying against powerful people with whom he associated. Do you think that will change, that opinion?
That's why I'm here right now, to tell the public what happened. And if I can't convince them that it was suicide, so what? So what? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? You want another Warren Commission? There's an old saying in jails and prisons: the canary can't sing if it can't breathe.
That reminds me of Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer's line in early 2017.
Yes, you take on the intelligence community and they have 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at you.
You take on the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at you.
We like that line. Chuck Schumer is correct. The intelligence community is very resourceful and potent.
Well, I don't plan on taking on the intelligence community.
That's a smart, careful choice. We write the laws. We decide who to apply them to, when to enforce them, what penalties are. What are you going to do?
But we do have a president who is willing to stand up against the swamp, who has been taking on and breaking down pedophile rings, arresting those engaged in human trafficking. And for those who engage in pedophilia or who depend on child sex trafficking to gain blackmail information, it seems like these can't be the end times.
This interview's over. And get rid of that shirt.